Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Brumley Speaker Series. My name is Julia Bordelon. I'm a Brumley Graduate Fellow, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Dulce Garcia. So Ms. Garcia is an attorney and executive director of the San Diego-based organization Border Angels. She was raised in California, where she studied political science at San Diego City College and the University of California, San Diego, and she received her law degree from the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Ms. Garcia opened her private practice in 2016, where she represents clients in cases on immigration, civil litigation, and criminal defense. And she also partners with the Mexican consulate and nonprofits to represent clients, and her practice hosts Know Your Rights workshops for the community as well. And her community-oriented work, though, really expands beyond her private practice. So as a DACA recipient herself, Ms. Garcia was a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the former Trump administration's termination of the DACA program in 2017. And currently, as the executive director of Border Angels, she helps lead their binational humanitarian and advocacy work along the southern border through a mission centered on a culture of love. Today, she will talk about this work and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected immigration at the US-Mexico border. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dulce Garcia.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. Yes, our mission is very much based on love, but it's an active kind of love. We show love for our neighbors, our migrant community. As we do water drops, we drop water and supplies in the desert, and we do so with a message of love and in hope of reducing the amount of deaths in our border. Since Operation Gatekeeper, since the wall went up, since we started to militarize more the southern border, we have seen an increased number of people dying. We estimate that it's over 11,000 deaths. In the fiscal year 2018, Border Patrol reported 283 deaths. These are folks that were actually confirmed as migrants crossing through the desert and passed away. But we can only imagine how many more were not found and passed away crossing the desert in hopes of surviving or having a better life in the US, and whose body has never been found and therefore is not part of this count. Unfortunately, because of the policies of the prior administration and with the world pandemic, the number of deaths and people crossing through the desert has increased. We see death also not only in the desert, but in the shelters. We see it in the detention centers. And all of this is a direct result of the failure of the administration to provide a humane way for people to migrate to the US. Since the Trump administration rescinded the asylum process, dismantled the asylum process, we have seen thousands of people having to wait in Tijuana. We have seen asylum seekers spend over a year on the Mexican border to survive. So our programs involved not only the water drop and the work in the desert, but also has expanded to providing a bond program in the last year. In the last year alone, we supported 69 migrants. We paid for their bonds to be released from the detention center. We supported over a dozen shelters in the Tijuana side of the border. And we supported a new program as well that we called Green Card for Kids, as well as continued other programs here in San Diego County, such as our day labor outreach and internships. Now, all of these programs have been directly impacted by COVID. Because of COVID, we had to shut down our Caravan of Love. That caravan would line up over a dozen vehicles with volunteers carrying over to the Tijuana side donations in kind for the various shelters. Because of COVID, the border was closed to only essential travel. And so we had to stop our Caravan of Love to protect also the shelters and try to control the spread of COVID-19. So instead, what we have done is we focused our work in providing monetary support directly to the shelters and having a more direct conversation with them as to what it is that they needed. One of the shelters, for example, needed more space. Should someone become test positive for COVID, they needed a place to quarantine. And if you can imagine having 200 people in one shelter, it's nearly impossible to keep a 6 feet distance, to socially distance with over 100 people that are in an enclosed space. And so we provided the monetary support. They provided their own labor and they expanded their shelter. In other shelters, it was hard to tell them to disinfect everything and keep everything clean when they depended on sunlight to dry their clothes. You know, they couldn't just throw their clothing in a washer and dryer. And even when they had over 100 people, they didn't have something as basic as a washer and dryer for them to keep things clean, whether it was sheets or clothing, or even the reusable masks that we were providing. So for some of these shelters, we provided over 20 sets of these appliances. Some didn't even have a refrigerator, so we provided a refrigerator and many other things that we realized were needed at these places to provide a decent place for migrants to wait, at least in a dignified way in Tijuana while their asylum case was being processed. Some needed something as basic as a new mattress, as a new bed, bed sheets, and with that, we realized that we also needed to keep pushing to end the MPP program. And so while we do some of this work, while we provide direct humanitarian aid, we're also doing at the same time the advocacy work that is needed to make real change. And so we celebrate the new administration taking on some of these issues already and having a dialogue with us, but we know that there's a lot more work to be done, and particularly in the shelters. We saw that people in the shelters were becoming so desperate because they kept getting their dates pushed, their court hearings pushed and pushed and pushed, and so some of them have been there for almost 2 years and still don't have an end in sight. And so some have returned home back to danger. Some have attempted to cross through the desert. And so in the last year or so, we saw an increased number of people, families attempting to cross through the desert. And so we saw indicators in the desert of kids crossing. We've been seeing kids' shoes, backpacks, toys, and female hygiene products, things that indicate to us that it's not just the sole male migrant, but it's actually families, women and children that are crossing the desert and doing so in higher numbers. We've seen also an increased number of children presenting themselves at the port of entry alone because the administration created an incentive to separate families, to deter migration. And so families, mothers, parents had to send their kids alone so that they could have a chance of entering the country, even if it was without their parent, and then have the hope of being reunited later. So we created this Green Cards for Kids program in collaboration with one of the counties here in California that provides legal representation for these kids. These kids were navigating the system, the foster care system, without legal representation in immigration proceedings. And so the administration and all its wise decisions decided to place these kids in removal proceedings to deport these kids without legal representation in immigration proceedings. And so Border Angels identified this gap and provided support for a dozen kids that are in the custody of the county and that have suffered uh, either abuse, abandonment, or neglect by one or more parents and are in danger if they were to be returned to their home country. And so, in collaboration with a private attorney, we've been able to successfully stop the deportation of at least one child and are in the process of applying for these kids for something called special juvenile status that would allow them to not only remain here in the US, but eventually process a green card, eventually receive this residency, permanent residency, and then eventually, hopefully, one day apply for citizenship. Um, and as we're doing this work, we also identified that the people that were in detention were at greater risk of dying from COVID because again, you can't socially distance yourself with 100 other people in your unit. Here in San Diego County, we have the Otay Detention Center, Otay Mesa Detention Center, and that detention center is run by a private corporation. So at the end of the day, what they're about is profiting. They are profiting from the suffering and the pain that our people are going through in that detention center. It's a federal prison where we're placing people that are asking for asylum, people that are asking for protection, people that are running away from their country because they have endured some great suffering. As an example, we had one asylum seeker whose child was killed in front of her, along with her husband. And she came from Africa and made it through 13 different countries to travel to make it to our border. And instead of welcoming her and embracing her, we put her in a detention center. And then we asked for a ransom to pay for her liberty to get her out of the detention center. The way that we treated her, and I mean the federal government treated her, is just cruel. And we have plenty of stories like that. All of the 69 folks that we have supported in the bond program have a similar story. There are people from over 19 different countries that have come and that we have supported have a story where they have endured great suffering. One was actually gouged and lit on fire and survived by miracle, and with the hopes of surviving in the US, traveled through South America and was placed in a detention center in Mexico, traveled through Mexico after being released after 6 months, showed up at a port of entry, and then was placed in a detention center for another 4 months until we paid thousands of dollars to get him out. And we have seen that some of the most vulnerable people among us, not just women and children, but also trans women, people that are from African countries, they are the ones that have been placed at risk even more as they have endured this long journey to make it to our border. And then again, we ask for a ransom to allow them to continue with their asylum case inside of the US. So we hope and we will be pushing this new Biden administration to end the detention of migrants that are presenting themselves at the port of entry with the hopes of surviving. Because if it's not done so through legal means and if asylum is not fully restored, we're going to see more people attempting to cross through the desert. And we're going to keep receiving these emergency calls where a sibling is calling because their brother is missing in the desert, or somebody's dad is missing in the desert. We receive these calls, these heartbreaking calls, all this time constantly. Just in the last month, in the last few weeks, I personally received 3 of them, where 2 of them were in around Texas, and family members were desperate to find out where their sibling was, where their loved one. And it's heartbreaking that guides do see this as an opportunity to take advantage of migrant siblings, and often leave people behind in the desert, and some get lost and we never find them. So it's again, all of this uh, a direct result of the policies that came about not only in the last 4 years with the Trump administration, but that have been around for decades. Since Operation Gatekeeper and the walls went up, there has been a need for us to put supplies and drop water in the desert. The bond program is something that other organizations, and again, we don't do this work in isolation. We do it with a collaboration of many other organizations to do this work, including, as an example, the National Bail Fund Network, to collaborate to get as many people out of these detention centers. But these detention centers, the system has been in place for many years, many years. I've had my brother be put in a detention center way before the Trump administration, and he eventually qualified for DACA, but he was put in a detention center, and we were being asked to pay $15,000 to get him out of the detention center. As an undocumented person, saving even one single dollar is a challenge. To save $15,000, it's nearly impossible when you're getting paid less than minimum wage, when you're getting paid under the table or working in the shadows. So for the government to ask us, ICE, to ask $15,000 for the release of my brother was nearly impossible. And since then, the I thought the country was moving in a much more progressive way, and then we had the Trump administration that increased and made everything a lot more difficult here on the border, and the suffering has certainly been exponentiated. But with COVID, the challenges have even increased more, because we saw the first death inside of the detention here in Otay Mesa, the Otay Mesa Detention Center. So we knew that we needed to act quickly to get as many people out of the detention center. But it was so heartbreaking that sometimes we were ready and willing and able to pay for the bond that they were asking, the thousands of dollars that they were asking for some of these people. And they were being put in a quarantine zone and not let us pay for their bond. And so what would happen is someone would test positive or show signs that they were positive for COVID. And then the rest of the unit, where there was 100 people or more sometimes, they would be in this isolation area. And even if they were not showing signs of having COVID, they would not be released. They would be quarantined. And so essentially what they were doing is, one person could have infected all the rest of them, all 100 people. And they were just, hoping that no one else would die, without really strategy behind it, making sure that everyone gets released so that people wouldn't die. So for us, it was counterintuitive to not allow people to be released, and instead forcing them to stay in an area where other people are showing signs of COVID-19. And sure enough, that's how we saw more and more people become sick and die. And so the work in the detention centers has not stopped. It's only been made worse with COVID, and we are still having to push the administration to release people, especially when we're still seeing high numbers of contaminations in this places, where they just don't have access to be able to control them. One of the migrants inside of the detention center called very desperate, afraid that he was going to die in there, and that he wasn't going to be able to say goodbye to his daughter and his wife. They had been separated at the border. They were all asking for asylum, and his wife and his child were allowed to go through and paroled in, but he was placed in a detention center, and he was afraid of dying from COVID. And he told us that he didn't have access to a mask, and that they weren't providing disinfectant or gel, because the guards were saying that they were going to use it for alcohol. And so how can you stay safe in a place where you're sleeping with 8 other people in your cell and around 100 other people when you're not being allowed to have any kind of protective gear on you? And as a community, we came together to provide masks for the detention centers. We had community members able to sew these masks and donate them, and the detention center wouldn't take them. Again, we have created a system where there is the incentive for these private corporations to not release people because they're getting paid per bed. And one of the first things that this administration, the Trump administration, did was ask Congress for for an increased number of beds in these detention centers with the expectation that they were going to get filled in. And as long as we have these private corporations running these places that are supposed to be housing our migrant siblings in a dignified way, we're going to see that there's going to be suffering and a lack of resources and services for these folks. I have personally gone inside of these detention centers and have seen people that have been placed on suicide watch. It's such a depressing place, but they're not offered mental health services. Their health screening involves a 3-minute check-in with a nurse, and you are asked, have you ever had a mental health issue? And some of these folks culturally don't even know what that means. I'm not even sure what that means. And then they just push through the system, put in a detention center, and these folks are given an A number, an alien registration number, and referred by the number, not by their name. And everything is meant to dehumanize them. They get shoes without shoelaces so that they don't commit suicide, jumpsuits, color coded to identify whether somebody has any criminal history or not. It's just the entire place is it's conducive to having these folks be depressed and call us in desperation. It's always heartbreaking to get these calls from people that are inside of the detention center that are afraid of dying in there and afraid of harassment in there, and even afraid of some of the guards. And so these places that are run by these private corporations have really no oversight. They report to ICE, and then ICE reports to no one. No one is holding accountable ICE for what happens with all the human rights violations that are happening inside of the detention centers, of the ways that migrants are punished for even speaking out and demanding something as crucial as a mask. Folks have been sprayed with chemicals and have bled because of the harsh chemicals that were sprayed to disinfect these places. And all of these complaints have resulted in punishing the migrants that are in the detention centers. And no one's holding accountable the private agencies, and no one's holding accountable ICE. So that's the difficulty that we have when we do this work, is that we know that paying bonds is not the end all of it. We have to change the system. And so that's where the advocacy work becomes crucial. It's been really challenging with COVID. We would do more protests outside, and with COVID, we've had to become creative and do webinars like this one to inform the community of what's happening, and have meetings with legislators in this format and calling them out on our social media. So if you don't follow Border Angels, I ask that you please follow us on social media or register for our newsletter so that you stay informed, because the work is not going to end now that we have a new administration. If anything, it's going to require a ton of work to push for the new administration to undo the system that has been in place for a while, but that the conditions given COVID exacerbated the need for this work to continue on the humanitarian perspective. But again, the work in the desert has been needed since Operation Gatekeeper. The work in the detention centers has been done by various organizations for decades now. And as long as we're still having contracts with private agencies like Core Civic that runs the Old Town Detention Center, as long as we are still putting in charge private corporations, we're going to see violations of human rights in these detention centers. As far as the support needed in the shelters, the excuse has been COVID. The excuse for closing the border has been COVID. And that is what the new administration, the Biden administration, is citing for not allowing all of these folks to come in. But every single day that they spend outside of the U.S. Is a day that people might lose hope, and it's a day that they have to endure. The people in Tijuana have had all this time without access to healthcare, without the right to education. And so these kids have spent over a year in Tijuana without education because they're migrants in Mexico coming from all over the world, and they don't have the paperwork to enroll in school, to use the healthcare system. And so the community has had to step up. Border Angels has supported one of the very few organizations that are in Tijuana, Refugee Health Alliance, that is a volunteer program from the UCSD medical school that has provided assistance in the shelters, and especially around when the pandemic broke out, providing, again, very simple water stations. Some of these shelters had no way to even wash their hands, and so with about $180, they were able to create one water station at a shelter. And so that replicated this in the over a dozen shelters to provide water stations for these folks so that they could even wash their hands, and providing healthcare screenings. There's still a lack of healthcare even now. The situation in Tijuana has only worsened with COVID. They have a high rate of deaths happening. They haven't been able to control COVID in Tijuana. So that's one of the biggest fears that we have, that should COVID hit one of the bigger shelters, one of the shelters where there's over 100 people being housed and over 40 kids, that we're afraid that some of the folks that haven't received healthcare attention in over a year are very vulnerable. And that's one of our biggest concerns. And that's one of the reasons why we're pushing the Biden administration to go ahead and start processing these people that have been waiting for so long in Tijuana. And with that, we have also had to, with COVID, we've had to close our volunteer programs to try to protect everyone and encourage everyone to stay at home. And so the volunteer opportunities that we've offered have been virtual opportunities, whether it's internships or tutoring online. We're still taking those if you're interested, but we did have to shut down our public water drops, our day labor outreach, where we go to the different Home Depots to provide resources to day laborers. And so unfortunately, it's only been a small team that's been doing this work to encourage people to stay at home during the pandemic. But hopefully this year we'll open up again these programs. But for the day labor outreach, what we have noticed is that because the Trump administration also took away the work permit for asylum seekers as they were navigating through their case, it created an incentive for our migrant siblings that were going through the asylum process to work unlawfully. And so we saw an increased number of Haitians and Central Americans by the Home Depots working on a day-to-day, and some of them living in their car, and they work all day and then they send money home. But because of COVID, they were struggling financially even more because people weren't doing more of their construction projects and they weren't hiring them. But what we also noticed was that the abuse, the rhetoric, um, the hateful rhetoric that the prior administration, the Trump administration, used, actually translated to hateful rhetoric coming from the community locally as well. And so some migrants did report that they were being harassed by other community members, people that would drive up to them and scream at them all kinds of horrible things. Some would work all day and then not get paid at the end of the day, and they would be threatened with deportation from ICE. And so we saw an increased number of those incidences with the Trump administration, and an increased fear. People didn't want to report it because they were afraid that it would impact their asylum case and they didn't want any trouble. So those are the changes that we saw with this last administration. And because of COVID, we know that they are suffering even more because the number of projects that people have out there in the community have decreased. And so for that reason, we've had to increase the kind of support that we offer them. And I think I'll stop there and entertain questions because I can talk all day about our programs. So I don't know, Julie, if you want to, if anyone has any questions yet.
Yeah, I'll ask folks if you have questions to start. We can you can drop them in the Q&A section of the webinar, but I can kick us off with one that I have. You mentioned you know, how COVID has obviously impacted a lot of your work, and I'm wondering if the switch to virtual to a lot of virtual work has facilitated things like know your rights trainings or more education and awareness programs because more people you know, in different areas are perhaps able to attend, or if at the same time you see that lack of access complicates that as well.
Yes, both. Having the ability to do virtual presentations, for example, allows us the chance to talk to more people. Like today, right? Today we can talk at the University of Texas, and in a couple of hours talk to another group in another part of the world. And so that's been the beautiful thing, that people are still engaged, even though we're going through a world pandemic and an economic crisis, and there's so many things that are being thrown at us. People are still engaged in the work that we do, and people still want to do something about it. And so at the same time, we have had such great support from the community, even though we're not physically out there as much. And so people still want to help out. And so what they have done for us, what the community has done, is they have done the fundraisers for us, right? So we wouldn't have any money to pay all of these bonds if we didn't have the community support. We don't get any grants from the government, zero. So all of the funding comes from individual support from our followers. And it's been beautiful to see people sell pencils that say abolish ICE, or come up with t-shirt sales, bake sales, cookies. There was one bar that named a drink after us for a day. I mean, people are getting creative in what they do to fundraise for us. So we didn't do any fundraising last year, except the people did it for us. The community did it because that was the community identified that was one way that they could support us, with doing the fundraising for us, so that we can focus on the programs. And so that allowed us to do more of the on the ground work if we didn't have to think about fundraising, because the community was providing for it. And so I think the fact that we did have to go virtually and depend on people to use all of these resources, like even social media, allowed us to to do some of the work in a much more strategic way that had a big impact, and still the support of community members that were being involved. And so I think the ability to do some of these things virtually, to communicate via Zoom, allowed for us to communicate with the community in a different way and inform people in a but at the same time, we do miss having that caravan of love and driving in caravan style, lining up the cars and filling them out with donations and going to the shelters. And I think there's nothing like walking through the desert yourself, carrying a gallon of water and dropping that and writing yourself a message of love in the water bottle, in the hopes that it does save a life. Like that experience is just, it's undescribable, right? Like I mentioned earlier in the day, seeing the wall for the first time, realizing there is a wall, contrary to what the president had been telling us. There is a wall already in place that has made an impact in people's lives for the last few decades. So there's nothing like physically experiencing these programs, whether it's a day labor outreach and just providing the meal for a day for these folks, or going to the shelters and providing a toy for a kid. There's nothing like experiencing yourself. But we hope that at the minimum virtually, we can transmit some of that to you guys, even if it's through Zoom, so that in the future, when we do reopen the programs, there will be all this interest of people wanting to come to the border and see what's going on for themselves. There's nothing like seeing the wall of the wall that goes through the ocean yourself, and hearing and seeing it, and we do miss that part of the educational aspect. When it comes to know your rights, it's been challenging informing the community that doesn't necessarily have access to technology, right? And when I say the community, I think the first thing that I think about is my own mom. My mom barely got onto texting in the last year. She doesn't have social media access, and she wouldn't know how to access the Know Your Rights session. So it's been challenging getting the word out to community members. One of the biggest tools that we've had has been speaking through media, traditional media, TV. Our parents are still reading the newspapers and still watching TV, watching Telemundo and Univision for their news, and so we've also done a lot of that in the last year. We did hundreds of interviews informing our community in more traditional ways, to make sure that they do get the correct messaging and information. So we've had to get creative on how to get the message out, whether it's getting more allies, more support for the organization, or whether it's to get the right information to our community. We've had to explore ways that we weren't doing before to make sure that everyone's informed. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And this question from Christian, I think touches on some things that you mentioned, that you just mentioned about, they ask, what is the best way for private citizens to help your organization currently?
Yes. So one of the biggest challenges that we expect with this new administration is keeping people informed. We don't want people to think that magically things are changing overnight and that we no longer need to drop water in the desert or no longer need to bond people out. On the contrary, this new administration has not committed to releasing people out of the detention center, even as we're still going through this pandemic. They have not committed to tearing down the wall that has already been built. And they have committed to bringing people that are in the MPP program that have been waiting to process them through the asylum claim. But they're not saying anything about the 8,000 people that are navigating their way through right now, and that the Mexican government has taken on in militarizing the southern border. So there's a lot of work to be done. And so one way to do so is follow us and stay informed, stay vigilant. Don't think that things are all of a sudden good just because we have a new administration. They're improving already. If you can see a change already on day one, and we're celebrating that. But things are not easy on the ground. We still have a need to do this work. And so that's one way, is to stay informed, just have the right information. The other one is by speaking fundraisers, getting the word out, sharing our work, uh, increasing our followers has actually translated to more support on the ground. And so again, follow us and share the work that we do, stay informed, stay vigilant. And then we still have to work towards creating a more welcoming environment. And that starts with self-love and love for our neighbors. And I know it does sound cheesy, but it has real repercussions. The hateful rhetoric did not start with Trump. Operation Gatekeeper actually is a result of that hateful rhetoric. And here in California, we're very immigrant friendly today, or we like to think that we are. But at one point with Prop 187, we were thinking of actually, while I was in school, of taking kids that were undocumented out of school. And luckily the Supreme Court got it right, and with Plyer, and said every kid is entitled to public education. But it took a long while for California to get here. And we still see the repercussions of that hateful rhetoric that made it onto law. You know, the IRA of 96 is still in place as of today. There's still permanent bars for migration. There's still criminalization of migration. And all of that happened years before Trump. And the deaths that we have seen at the border have been occurring way before the last administration. And so it sounds cheesy to say, you know, spread love in the world, but the hateful rhetoric has had real repercussions. As I mentioned, like as an example with the day labor outreach, people feeling emboldened to call our siblings by horrible names. And it's not just a matter of sticks and stones. These things actually end up translating to policies that have real impact in our community. Whether it's changing or passing, actually, if you're being positive about it, like here in California, we passed resolutions protecting DACA recipients at a local level that said, look, this is going to be a welcoming city for migrants. And that our community hears that and immediately feels a relief, at ease, instead of being vigilant all the time. And so locally, if you're in a place that is not immigrant friendly, I would start locally as well. And even on a more micro level in your own school. You know, as I was navigating law school as an undocumented student in undergrad, I couldn't even trust my own study partners to tell them that I was undocumented. No one knew in law school that I was undocumented because I was afraid my own classmates were going to turn me over to ICE, because it's a competitive environment, right? And you're in a curve. And so you never know who to trust. And so that was the mentality that I had. So create these safe spaces, even in clubs. You never know what somebody's going through. Maybe somebody's undocumented and you don't realize it. Maybe someone's suffering internally, and so just be nice to yourself as well, and to others, and that does have a ripple effect. It's not just about sticks and stones.
Yeah, thank you. I'll field a question from Joseph, who asks, what is the most effective way for private citizens to pressure state government officials to support abolishing ICE and releasing migrants from border camps?
Excellent question. So I'm very much a believer of doing change locally as well. So one of the things that we did here locally in San Diego as part of the advisory board for San Diego Immigrant Rights Consortium this last year was we held a Truth Act forum. We have in California, it's a misnomer, it's sanctuary law, but it's really a law that just disentangles local law enforcement with ICE and immigration enforcement. So Texas doesn't have that. Right, that would be the goal to have if the federal government refuses to protect us. You know, you can start. That's a state level thing to do, is pass some equivalent to sanctuary law or what we call here in California, SB 54. And part of that is involves taking action and calling out the local sheriffs when they're violating these state laws. And some are not even a violation of it, but they're against the spirit of these sanctuary laws. And so what we did last year was we called out the sheriff for publishing a list of people that are released every single day. What that did is alerted ICE to say, oh, look, Jose Hernandez is getting released today. Dulce Garcia is getting released. And so they would focus on these Latino sounding names, very much profiling, so that when someone would be released from our local jails, they would be outside waiting for them, right? They would not be waiting for, I don't know, John Smith, right? They would be waiting for Jose. And that was not necessarily a direct violation of our SB 54 protections, but it did facilitate ICE's work to be able to do their removal enforcements. So that's one thing that you can do locally, is be vigilant at a local level. What is happening in your neighborhood? If there is a detention center near you, are they considering renewing their contract with the private corporation? So here we have Otay Mesa Detention Center, and the private corporation is Core Civic, and we're fighting very much for them to not renew a contract. So in the state of California, the governor actually passed the law that says no more contracts for these corporations, and they're, of course, they rushed to renew it before the deadline. And so in Texas, that's one way you can do so locally, because the land may be owned locally. It could be public land owned by the city, an incorporated city, or a state. And so be aware of where they want to build a new one, because I was going to say these jerks, but these evil corporations, they got smart and they realized, okay, maybe we can rent out or lease a place that is not owned by the state or by the city. And so be aware of where these private corporations are looking to either build their detention centers or contract and renew their contract. And so, I mean, I can go on and on about all the different things at a local level that can get done, but I think the resolutions have been really significant and symbolic at a local level. Here in the city of Chula Vista, when we passed a resolution in support of Dreamers, it meant everything. When the city passed a resolution to be a welcoming city, it meant everything for us as well. So there's various things that you can do. The most direct way to start the conversation is reach out to your legislators. If you're going to take on a local action, don't be afraid to speak out at city council meetings, and don't be afraid to schedule a meeting with legislators. But the work that we do is not in isolation, and so we collaborate with many different organizations to build power, so then the legislators feel more inclined to talk with us, because otherwise they're going to have 50 different orgs knocking on their door. And so if you don't have a coalition, and sometimes we build groups, ad hoc groups. We built one recently when we found out that the city of Chula Vista was actually using 2 patrol cars, 2 police vehicles, to take data. It's an automatic license plate reading program that shares that data with 800 agencies, including ICE and Border Patrol. And no one had any idea that this was happening until it was reported in a local paper. And we immediately took action. Within 24 hours, we had 30 different organizations commenting at a city council meeting. And the city council, that within 24 hours, committed to not sharing the data with Border Patrol and with ICE. But that doesn't mean the work is done. We still have to have meetings and introduce ourselves to the new city council and ask and push the mayor to end the surveillance program completely, not just not sharing with ICE and Border Patrol, but with the rest of the agencies as well. And so there are wins that you can celebrate locally. That's easier than pushing a whole big giant federal government that's going to require collaboration across the US, because there are always interests and at hand, and sometimes people that you might think even are on your side might have a different view on things as well. And that is going to be one of the big challenges if we're looking at comprehensive immigration reform to be pushed with this administration. There's going to be competing interests, and someone is going to be left out of this comprehensive immigration reform. The way that many people were left out of the DACA program, very arbitrarily, they said a date when you had to come in. They set a birthday that you had to have, you know, an age limit placed on it, and it was pretty arbitrary. And so even though 1.2 million people potentially could be protected under the DACA program, it still left millions of people out. And so with comprehensive immigration reform, that's going to be a big conversation. Who is going to be left out and who's going to be protected? And so to push those kinds of actions forward at a national level requires a lot of work and collaboration with other organizations. But I think you can make a great impact even locally. And pulling something like the sheriff's list, that was actually the easiest way for ICE to deport people from the local jails, was a huge win for us last year. And surprisingly enough, because other groups were doing work with criminal reform and protesting on the streets with Black Lives Matters, the cops were like, the sheriff kind of gave in on this issue, knowing that he had to deal with so many more issues because our siblings were working with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so sometimes you got to look for opportunities and take those wins and celebrate them. That was a big victory that surprisingly didn't take that much work last year, because they had other bigger issues to worry about and they were afraid of. But that's one of the ways to do so, is start locally. You can even do it in your own university. If your university doesn't have a dream center, doesn't even acknowledge that there are undocumented people in your school, start there. Ask your administration, how many undocumented people are at your university? And do they even know? Are they even acknowledging that there are undocumented people? Or are people like me when I was in school not feeling safe, not feeling like you can come out and say I'm undocumented and I need support? The University of California has opened up dream centers where people feel comfortable. Now they've increased the number of undocumented people that are enrolled to 500 people here in just the San Diego University. And they've done that across the state of California. And the UC system was one of the schools that actually sued Trump with us when they took DACA away. So what is your university doing to protect undocumented students? Are they offering financial support? Are they treating undocumented people like locals or out of state? Are they, because at some point I had to pay out of state tuition here in California before the DREAM Act, the California DREAM Act. And I was paying 3 times as much as a foreigner, even though I grew up here. I went to the high school here. I was residing here, but the school was not acknowledging that I was a resident here. So what policies are in place at your university? And maybe you can do something as a student there. So it just depends how big and how involved you want to get.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of these great questions and just for your inspiring answers. There's so much joy, and I mean it's such hard work, but you bring so much joy to it as well, and it's so exciting to see and learn about. I don't see any other questions, so we might be able to wrap up here. But yeah, just thank you again so much. Yeah, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Yes. If please again follow us on Instagram. We don't have TikTok yet, but unfortunately we're gonna have to see that coming this year. But follow us on Instagram. It's Border Angels Official. And then if you want to reach out to me, I'll drop. Can I write in here? I don't think I can write in here, huh?
Yeah, I can circulate in an email.
Okay.
Yeah,
my information. You may go ahead and reach out to me if you have any other questions. Maybe if you're considering law school or something like that, I'm also available for those kinds of questions. If you are interested in going in the nonprofit world as well, But I do want to, again, if you take anything from what was said today, is that you guys have a ton of power. You guys have a ton of power as individuals. And we saw that in the polls this year. The young vote was so important and made such a big difference. And the world is changing, where young people are doing such incredible work, and I know like the adults have messed up a little and reverted in some ways when it comes to having humane rights and protections across the globe. We do see migration as a global crisis. What we're having at the border right now is a crisis, is a humanitarian crisis that was exacerbated by the lack of leadership in the last administration and the very cruel and inhumane policies that came about, where we were rejecting asylum seekers, very vulnerable people, and telling them to wait in line in Mexico. But at the same time, I have so much hope, and you said I bring joy, and it's because you guys, I mean, you guys are even in this call listening in, right? You guys are interested and involved and wanting to know what's going on here at the border. And not everyone does that. And I think that's why I have hope, because more and more younger and younger people are getting involved and making a big difference. And we saw it in the polls, and most of our supporters are young people as well. And so that's why I talk about these very difficult things with a smile on, because I know you guys are paying attention, and you guys are the ones that are going to be reaching out and saying, I want to volunteer. What can I do? And so that brings me hope and joy in the work that we do, because it is you guys that are spreading this this message of love, whether it's directly volunteering with us or doing in your own field what you do. So even if you end up being a doctor, not directly relating to immigrant rights, in your boardroom, you can have a say of what happens in your hospital, in your clinic, to protect immigrant rights. If you're going to be a school counselor, I know you're going to be a lot more compassionate when dealing with migrant children. My high school counselor told me I was never going to be a lawyer, and I was never going to even go to community college. So I know you guys are going to make such a big difference and a big impact in our communities locally and nationally. And so that's what gives me hope. And so let's keep on spreading this message of love.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.